Hello everyone, welcome to the second NWEA Formative Assessment webinar series featuring Dylan William, Practical Techniques for Implementing Formative Assessment. I'm Kelly Goodrich with NWEA, and I get to be your host today. First, a bit of housekeeping. We've got actually over 1,000 people registered to join this webinar today, so everyone will be on mute. You can still send us questions though, and via the question feature on your screen. And we will do our very best to answer the questions during today's call. If we get similar questions, we'll probably kind of group them up and answer them in a general way. Today's webinar is really something unique, I think, out there for educators. We're going to give you insight into what formative assessment can look like as a part of your everyday classroom practice. And while I believe most of us recognize Dylan as a real thought leader in formative assessment, can't forget that he's actually also a practitioner, a teacher, and a person who is passionate about changing classrooms where kids drive their own learning. And so today you're going to learn from his expertise as well as his expertise as a teacher and his continuing work around the world in helping teachers and kids implement formative assessment in the classrooms. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dylan William and kicking off our second webinar. It's yours, Dylan.
Thank you, Kelly. In the first webinar, I argued for why formative assessment needs to be a priority for every single school. And in this webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice. The first question is, why is formative assessment so important? And I think the simple reason is that what children learn as a result of any piece of teaching that we do is actually unpredictable. In her PhD thesis, Brenda Denver looked at the numerical skills of young children, and she produced a complex map of all the skills that children acquired. And what she found was that there were some strong dependencies. This grid, this set of red and green circles, is a part of that grid that she produced for each student. And they show the dependencies. So each of these blobs is a skill, and the arrows denote dependencies. So if there's an arrow pointing towards a particular blob, it means that that blob that it's pointing towards is a prerequisite for another skill. So for example, she discovered that students couldn't do subtraction unless they could count backwards by 1. And this shows the current state of achievement of a young girl called Jennifer. And if you look at this, you can see that she's got 4 skills that are highlighted in green and a number that she has yet to acquire, which are shown in red. And of course, if you look at the pattern of dependencies, the obvious one to target for her instruction is the lowest red blob, because that's a dependency for several other skills that she needs to acquire. So what happened was that the teacher worked out a scheme to teach Jennifer this one particular skill highlighted by the blue arrow. And after the teacher had implemented this program designed to develop this one skill, the teacher assessed Jennifer's skills and discovered that this is what she learned. She'd learned things that were completely unrelated. In case you missed it, I'll go back and show you that what she learned were the 3 skills on the left there, and she still hadn't shown any mastery of the skill that was the focus of the teaching. So the big idea here is that children do not learn what we teach. In other words, assessment is important because it's the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessing that we can find out whether the instructional activities that we engage in as teachers produce the learning that we want. Now, because there is quite a strong body of research showing that formative assessment is a very powerful way of increasing student achievement, there have been a number of people who've claimed that what they do is formative assessment. And I've heard the term formative assessment used in a lot of ways. There are a number of scenarios on the third slide here. A district science supervisor uses test results to plan which professional development workshops she's going to run for her teachers in the summer. So she sees that teachers in the district are less good at teaching physical science than life science, according to the state test scores. So she plans workshops for the teachers on the teaching of physical science. Some people call that formative. In other cases, teachers are doing an item-by-item analysis of their 5th grade math scores to review their 5th grade curriculum. So they look at which items their students did well on and did badly on, and then they figure out whether they can strengthen their curriculum to address any weaknesses they find. Many test vendors now will offer schools or districts the chance to come in and test the students every 10 weeks to predict which students are on course to pass the state test in March. That's often called formative testing. In Japanese middle schools, it's very common for a unit on pulleys and levers, for example, to be allocated 13 class periods, but the content is only allowed to take up the first 10 or 11 periods. In the next period, the teacher will give the students a quiz, and she takes in the quiz papers, but she doesn't grade them, she just reads them, and on the basis of what she sees there, she plans what she's going to deliver in the remaining lessons for that unit. In some schools, students who fail a test on Friday have to come back on a Saturday to make up what they missed. Another school, a teacher was teaching the students about mass and weight, and 2 minutes before the end of the lesson gave every student a 3x5 index card and asked them to explain the difference between mass and weight. As the students left, they turned in these cards anonymously, and when all the students had left, she read the cards and then put them in the trash, because then she knew where to start tomorrow's lesson. And finally, a teacher of AP Calculus is just reviewing graph sketching with the class, and she asks the whole class to sketch the graph of y equals 1 over 1 plus x squared on mini dry erase boards and hold them up so she can see whether they've got it right or not. Now, a great deal of effort has been expended on working out whether these things really are formative or not, and I think that question is ultimately fruitless, because there are too many people making investments in different kinds of formative assessments for them to actually come to any consensus. So I think we should stop worrying about whether these things are formative. Some people say they are, some people say some of them are not. Let's not worry about that. Let's just figure out whether they are good or not. And what the research shows there is actually quite clear. The term formative assessment has been largely hijacked, and I think it's useful to look at long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle to try and make sense of all this. So the long cycle stuff is the across units or terms, typically cycle lengths of 4 weeks to 1 year. And these kinds of formative assessments can be useful for monitoring student progress and for producing curriculum alignment. Are we teaching what students need to learn? But when I first came to America, I learned a very useful saying: weighing the pig doesn't fatten it. And in the same way, repeatedly monitoring students' progress is a good thing to do, because you need to understand whether the school is heading in the right direction, but it's not formative assessment, it's just monitoring. Many schools have invested a great deal of effort in involving students in the success criteria that lead to grades, and there's no doubt that's a valuable thing to do, and it can produce improved student-involved assessment, and it has also improved teachers' thinking about learning. But again, the evidence is actually quite modest and not very clear that this is actually having a big impact on learning. What the evidence seems to show is that the closer the formative assessment is to the learning, in other words, the shorter the cycle, the bigger the impact. So when teachers do minute by minute and day by day formative assessment, then you get the really biggest impact on student learning. Now, teachers have always done this. Teachers have always relied on cues from their students to judge whether lessons are going well or not, but they tend not to use this information very systematically. And so they often rely on expressions on students' faces. I saw a nice example of a teacher actually changing that very slightly to make it much more powerful. She was reviewing punctuation with a class, and she wanted to check that they could actually correctly punctuate the sentence, "It's on its way." So she wrote up the statement on the board with no punctuation, and then asked the students to contribute punctuation. One boy came up and added the period, another boy came up and added an apostrophe, and another student came up and added a second apostrophe. The teacher waited for anybody else to want to make changes. Nothing happened. So she then said, "Is that now correct?" And every student in the class had to signal by holding a thumb up or a thumb down whether the answer was correct or incorrect. And this, to me, encapsulates the principle of effective classroom formative assessment: engagement and responsiveness. That teacher is engaging every single student in the class, and she's using the responses she gets from her class to make judgments about what to do next. And the reason the engagement is so effective is because she's created a situation in which there's no place to hide. Because if a student signals thumbs up, then they've shown the teacher they don't understand, because there is still an error in the statement on the board. But if the teacher sees the students signaling thumbs down, then the teacher can obviously pick on that student and ask them to come up to the front and correct any errors that might remain in the sentence written on the board. So those two principles, engagement and responsiveness, are, in my view, the most important parts of classroom formative assessment. Now, obviously, by itself, those two ideas of just engagement and responsiveness aren't enough to give us really practical advice about what to do. So I think we need to unpack formative assessment a little bit. And I think that the best place to start is with three key processes in learning: where the learner is going, where the learner is right now, and how to get there. We also need to think that there are different roles of different actors in the classroom. We have the teacher, we have the peer, and we have the learner themselves. This gives us a matrix of 9 cells, and we could discuss the contents of each of these 9 cells separately. But I think it makes sense to think about these cells in clusters. So I think the first cluster is clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions. The important idea here is that students should know where they're going. Teachers need to clarify this, communicate this to students, and students need to understand where they're going. This is probably the most copied and perhaps the least well done of all the learning intentions. In many districts now, there is a district policy that has to be a learning intention posted up for every lesson. This is written up by the teacher on the board, copied by the students into their notebooks, and subsequently ignored by everybody, but it's okay if an administrator walks past, you're covered. Now, it is a good idea that students understand where they are in their learning and where they're going, but it's not always possible to do it with narrow learning objectives. Sometimes you can't be that clear. If I'm getting students to balance chemical equations, then I do want to get all the students to the same point. But if I'm getting students to react to a poem by D.H. Lawrence, some students will head off in one direction, and other students, quite legitimately, will head off in a completely different direction, and that's okay. So sometimes there is just one narrow learning intention for the entire class, but sometimes there is a whole horizon of possible goals that the teacher would be happy with. So I think it's important to understand that sometimes you can't be clear in advance of where the learning might go. Second, telling the students where they're going can sometimes spoil the journey. In mathematics, if I'm getting students to do problems that involve realizing that triangles with the same base and the same height have the same area, then if I tell them we're doing problems on the areas of triangles, that gives the game away. That spoils the problem. So sometimes telling students where they're going makes the journey less interesting. And finally, and we've done interviews with students on this point, students tell us that starting every single lesson with a lesson objective makes for uninspired and uninspiring teaching. Sometimes students say to us, it's much more interesting to start off with a question that motivates the discussion rather than a narrow learning objective, which can come halfway through the lesson. So, although it's important, there's no single best way to do this. We should make sure that students understand where they're going in general terms, but an objective for every lesson isn't necessarily the best way to do this. The second one is not just questioning students, but all the ways that we find out where students are. So we call this engineering effective discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence of learning. So questioning, sure, but also making statements. If I'm teaching the causes of the First World War to a high school history class, one question I might ask is, who was to blame? And what I'll get then is a kind of popularity contest with students plumping for Russia, Serbia, France, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Britain, or whatever. And of course, the students think that by choosing one of those answers, they've done enough work to satisfy the question. If instead I say, Russia was most to blame for the outbreak of World War I, what do you think? What is interesting is that most students feel obliged to give a rationale for their choice. So when you make statements rather than asking questions, it can often lead to a more thoughtful and more extended response by students. The third strategy is providing feedback that moves learners forward. And this is phrased in this way for a very particular reason. Back in 1998, Paul Black and I suggested that comments would be more useful than grades as feedback. And to their credit, many teachers followed that advice. The problem is that most of the comments that students were getting were not particularly useful. They were saying, effectively, this would have been a better piece of work had you done the following things, but you didn't, so it isn't. As Douglas Reeves points out, it's like the difference between getting a medical and a post-mortem. And too often, feedback is backwards-looking rather than forward-looking. So this strategy is framed as providing feedback that moves learners forward, to signal very clearly that this is about making sure that students actually are using the feedback to move their own learning forward rather than looking backwards. The last two strategies recognize the fact that, as Rick Stiggins reminds us, the most important instructional decisions are not taken by teachers, they're taken by students. It doesn't matter how good the feedback is. If students do not want to learn, if students do not feel that they're able to learn, then no learning will take place. So we have activating students as learning resources for one another and activating students as owners of their own learning. These 5 strategies effectively define the territory of formative assessment. If you're doing formative assessment, you're doing at least one of these, and if you're not doing one of these, you're probably not doing formative assessment. The big idea here is that we use evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in classrooms to meet learner needs. A very simple idea, a very difficult thing to put into practice. One can talk about this as an educational positioning system. I'm often struck by the difference between the way that pilots navigate and teachers assess. Pilots rarely take off from one starting point with a clear view of their destination, 6.5 hours flying time on a bearing of 070 degrees, and then, as they near the end of their journey, begin looking for an airport to set down. Now, what they do is they start out by being clear about where their origin is, by being clear about where the destination is. They plan the route, but then they begin the learning journey and make regular checks on progress along the way. And if necessary, they make adjustments to the course as conditions dictate. And so in the same way, good teaching involves being clear about where you're starting out from, be clear about where you're going, but then as you begin the learning journey, make regular checks on progress along the way and make adjustments as the learning is taking place. So you don't find yourself as a teacher reaching the end of the learning journey, finding the students aren't with you. So now I'd like to turn to some practical examples that we can use to help teachers do this. But at first, I want to think about some research studies that just really bring home the power of these techniques. And first, I'll start with clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions. This study by White and Fredrickson was a very detailed study of some 7th graders learning physics with the Thinker Tools curriculum. So 3 teachers, each teaching 4 7th grade science classes in 2 US schools, participated in this 14-week experiment. And during the 14 weeks, each student worked with others on 7 2-week investigative projects. And for each project, they did a presentation on what they discovered, which was scored 1 to 5, and they wrote up their presentations, which was scored 1 to 5. So overall, each student got a score from 2 to 10 for each of the 7 investigative projects. The teachers taught all 4 groups exactly the same way for 2.5 hours each week. But for 30 minutes, they did something different with 2 of the classes from what they did with the other 2 classes. So 2 of the classes discussed their likes and dislikes about the teaching they were getting. That was meant to be the control group. And these 2 classes were asked to make suggestions to the teacher about how to improve their learning of physics in these experiments. The other 2 classes for each teacher discussed how their work would be assessed. They were given scoring rubrics, and they were encouraged to support each other by saying things like, well, you'll get a level 2 for this because you've done this, but you haven't done this, so you won't get a level 3. So the only difference between the 4 classes taught by each teacher was this 30 minutes. Half of the classes discussed their likes and dislikes, half of them engaged in this process of reflective assessment. To check that this study was properly balanced, all the students in the study were given the comprehensive test of basic skills. And then they looked at the scores in physics achieved by the students according to their scores on the test of basic skills. So they divided all the students into 3 bands, low, middle, and high, according to their score on the comprehensive test of basic skills. And what they found was quite a strong gradient with their physics scores, with their basic skills scores. So the students who scored in the lowest third on the basic skills test averaged 4.6 on their 7 projects. Those in the middle third averaged 5.9, and those in the top third averaged 6.6. Now, one question that Obviously, might arise here is how much benefit was there for the reflective assessment group? You'll have realized that I wouldn't even be talking about this study unless the students doing the reflective assessment benefited. But one question that arises is who benefits most from reflective assessment? Is it the low achievers? Is it the average achievers? Is it the high achievers? Or do all students benefit equally? And what I think is quite interesting is that teachers are usually pretty evenly divided on this question. And what they discovered in this experiment was it was the low achievers who benefited most, but all students benefited. So if you look at the scores, you will see that the highest achievers scored 6.6 on their 7 projects in the control group and 7.4, 0.8 levels higher in the reflective assessment group. So they benefited. But the size of the benefit was much greater for the lowest achieving students. There, the benefit was over 2.1 levels. And this underlies a very important feature of effective formative assessment. Sharing learning intentions closes achievement gaps because it's more beneficial for the lowest achievers than the highest achievers, because often the highest achievers already know what good learning looks like, what good work in a subject looks like. So one of the things we can do to close the achievement gap is to make sure that all students are getting access to the codes for success, if you like. A couple of techniques here. A science teacher, before she gets her students to do a lab report, she gives them 3 or 4 lab reports from a previous year's classroom, suitably anonymized, of course, and she asks them then to talk about what's good about the good ones. Are some of these better than others? If so, what's good about the good ones? What teachers typically find when they use this technique is, first of all, students are much better at spotting mistakes in other people's work than they are in their own. But second, when they've spotted other people making mistakes, they are far less likely to make the same mistakes in their own work. And so sharing learning intentions through anonymized sample work seems to be a very powerful way of getting students understanding what success looks like. It sounds counterintuitive. This is time where we could be actually having the students do some more work, and yet getting them to look at other people's work can be very powerful. A second technique here is to provide students the chance to design their own tests. One study divided students randomly into 4 groups. One group was allowed to prepare for the test in whichever way they felt was most suitable for them. One group was given a study guide. One group was given practice test papers like the one they were going to be taking and invited to practice on these tests. And the 4th group were asked to write single test items with correct answers about what they had been learning. This final group, the ones who wrote test items about what they've been learning, actually outperformed the other 3 groups. So certainly from about 3rd or 4th grade onwards, giving students the chance to design their own test questions is the most effective form of test preparation. Engineering effective discussions, activities, and classroom tasks that elicit evidence of learning. The design of questions is very important. These 2 questions come from the 3rd International Math and Science Study, TIMSS. And these are the data for Israeli students in middle school. So question 1 is which fraction is the smallest? Success rate 88%. Question 2, which fraction is the largest? Success rate 46%. Now some people are surprised that the success rate for the second item is so much lower than the first, because they are both asking about the relative magnitudes of fractions. So why is that second question so much more difficult for middle schoolers than the first question? Well, it turns out that many students in middle school have a naive strategy for fractions, which involves just focusing on the denominators. So they come to believe that the smallest fraction is the one with the largest denominator, and the largest fraction is the one with the smallest denominator. So they look at the first question and they're looking for the smallest fraction, so they look for the largest denominator, so they focus on 6 and they choose A, and that's correct. When students with the same idea come to the second question, which fraction is the largest, they look for the smallest denominator, find B, find 4, choose B, and that's incorrect. and 39%, in other words, 3/4 of the students who got this question wrong chose the same wrong answer. 39% chose B. Now, what's interesting here is if you add 46% to 39%, you get something very close to 88%, which suggests that many students who got the first question right got it right for the wrong reason. They had an incorrect strategy that happened to get them the correct answer. And this illustrates a very important feature of our classroom questioning. When we ask a class a question and we get the answer we were hoping for, there's a very strong temptation to conclude that the students understand. But if the questions we use are more like the first and the second question here, we may make erroneous conclusions. We may conclude the students' learning is on track when in fact they have completely different ideas. So it turns out that effective questioning is the starting point for effective feedback. You can't give effective feedback unless you ask the right question in the first place. And asking the right questions in the first place is difficult. It's very hard to come up with these questions on the spur of the moment. And in fact, most teachers find it's very hard to come up with these questions on their own, given any amount of time. As one teacher said to me, you can't do this on your own. You'll always be victim to your own way of thinking. So what teachers tell us is that finding time outside classroom time to work with colleagues on planning high-quality questions they can use in their classroom is the starting point for effective classroom practice. Now, once you've got good questions, two really practical strategies here are no hands up and using all student response systems. I'll say a word about each. No hands up is probably the most important strategy or technique that any teacher can adopt. Because if teachers ask questions and allow students to volunteer responses, they are in effect creating two classrooms in their classroom. In one is the classroom full of the volunteers who are raising their hands and trying to engage in every single question the teacher is asking. If that's what teachers are doing, then they're actually creating two classrooms. One classroom with the volunteers getting smarter by engaging in everything the teacher is doing, and at the same time, in the same classroom, there's another classroom being created of all those students who are trying to avoid being picked on, trying to stay below the radar, and those students are missing out on the chance to get smarter. It's been called the Matthew effect. After the passage in the Bible, to those that have, more shall be given, and from those who have nothing, what little they have will be taken away. So we see this in all kinds of areas. Athletes given more training get better. Athletes who aren't selected for the same training opportunities don't get any better. So the gap between those who are already successful gets bigger, and because the ones who are not getting any help, not getting that support, don't improve. So no hands up, some kind of technique that students are picked on at random is very important. Now, obviously, students will resist to begin with, and therefore every teacher needs a number of strategies to cope with when students say things like don't know. One is to say, okay, I'll come back to you, and get 2 or 3 different answers from other students, and then come back to the first student and say, which of those 3 answers do you like best? Doug Lamoff, in his book Teach Like a Champion, talks about the strategy he calls no opt-out. So if a student says don't know, the teacher asks them what support they'd like in giving the right answer. So sometimes you can ask another student, you can ask the audience, or phone a friend and get help to answer the question. The important point is that when the teacher picks on a student to answer a question, don't know is not an acceptable response. Now, techniques like no hands up can create engagement, but they're actually rather poor bases for teachers' decision making. When I was teaching full-time, the decision I made most often every single day was, shall I go over this page one more time, or shall I go on to the next page? And of course, how did I do this? I would make up a question on the spur of the moment, ask the class, 6 students would raise their hands, I'd pick on one of them, she'd give me the correct answer, and I would say, good, and move on. Which is really, when you think about it, rather a silly thing to do, because I'm assuming the other 29 students already knew the answer, or now are okay because they've had one student give me the correct answer. So in any kind of group-based instruction, I think it's very important every 20 to 30 minutes to get some kind of response from every single student. And there are a number of ways of doing this. You can use those electronic voting systems, sometimes called classroom clickers. You can get students to do finger voting by holding up 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 fingers. You can use dry erase boards. and of course the exit pass question I mentioned earlier. These are all forms of all student response systems. The important thing is that every student knows that their answer is going to be seen. It creates engagement and it provides information for the teacher, which allows them to make a smarter decision about what to do next. Feedback. Getting feedback right is very hard because when we give students feedback, two things can happen. The feedback can show the students they have yet to reach the goal. And of course, if that happens, we hope they will increase their effort to reach the goal. The danger, of course, is that our feedback shows the students that they've already reached the goal they want to reach, and therefore they can ease off. There are four responses a student can make to feedback. One is to change the behavior. That's exactly what we want them to do if they fall short of the goal. But of course, we don't want them to change behavior if they've already reached the goal. We don't want them to exert less effort. Rather, we want them to change the goal, to increase their aspiration. So students can either change their behavior, change the goal. They can abandon the goal. They can decide that math is stupid and they don't want to actually have any time, spend any more time on wasting their time on learning math. Or they can reject the feedback by saying that the teacher is an idiot. So here's why getting feedback right is so hard. When we give students feedback, there are four different things the students can do. There are two different scenarios. So that means that when we give students feedback, there are 8 things that can happen, and 6 of them are bad. The only good outcomes are when the feedback shows performance falls short of the goal, students increase effort, and when it shows students they've already reached the goal, they increase aspiration. And so it's not surprising that studies of feedback have found that it's very difficult to get feedback to be effective. 2 researchers at Rutgers University in New Jersey decided to review every single study that had ever been conducted on feedback. They found over 3,000 research results. They went back to 1905 and looked at every published study on feedback from 1905 to 1995. They found some studies on feedback that only had a single participant. So they decided to set a lower limit of 10 participants for these studies. They found some where there wasn't a control group, so there was no comparison. They found some where feedback was changed between the control group and the experimental group, but other things were changed as well, so it was impossible to be sure that it was the feedback that had created the effect, and others where performance wasn't measured before or afterwards, and some where it wasn't possible to work out how much of an impact feedback had had because they hadn't provided details of the effect sizes. So when they excluded those, they were quite surprised to discover that out of the 3,000 research reports they found, only 131 made the cut in terms of being well designed. But those did report 607 experiments involving about 12,500 individuals. What they were even more surprised to discover was that while on average feedback did increase achievement, effect sizes were highly variable. And in 50 out of the 131 studies, the effect of feedback was to lower student performance. In other words, in almost 2 out of every 5 cases, you'd been better off shutting up than actually giving the feedback. And when they looked in detail about what was it about the studies where feedback was ineffective, they discovered it was when it was ego involving. You're a good employee, you're a bad employee. You're a good student, you're a bad student. You get an A, you get an F. Feedback was effective when it did 2 things. When it's told learners what they needed to do to improve, but more important still, told them how to go about it. So the important thing is that feedback causes thinking. It causes an engagement in moving forward. A couple of ideas here. Comment-only grading. As I mentioned earlier, Paul Black and I recommended this. The difficulty is students don't like reading comments. If there's a grade there, they won't read the comment at all. In some studies where they've actually looked at giving students comments and grades at the same time, in one study, students were given both a score and a comment. 40% of the students could not even recall having seen a comment. So comment-only grading is clearly a good idea, but it's still hard to get the students to look at the comments they've been given. One teacher, she tried a new wrinkle. She's an 11th grade language arts teacher, and the students had done an essay on Shakespeare, and rather than writing her comments on the students' notebooks, as she used to do, she wrote the comments on strips of paper. And each group of 4 students received back their 4 essays and the 4 strips of paper, and their task was match the comments to the essays. And the reason this was so effective is because the teacher had managed to slow down that ego involvement. When the student picks up one of those comments, they're reading it to find out what it says, not what it says about them, because they don't know whose comment it is. Now, comment-only grading works very well in text-based subjects like language arts and social studies. Math teachers often complain that it doesn't work as well in math. So if you've got 20 equations the students have done and you check 15 of them and put a cross next to 5 others, the students can work out for themselves they got 15 out of 20, whether they're told the correct answer or how many they've got correct or not. So one technique that teachers can try as an alternative is not giving the students complete solutions. In other words, saying to the students, 5 of these equations are incorrect. You find them, you fix them. Somebody recently wrote a book called Never Work Harder Than Your Students, and I think that it really is a very important principle of teaching that no teacher should work harder than the students. I think the corollary of this rule is that feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. I often ask teachers, do you believe that your students spend as long taking on board the feedback you give them as it takes you to provide it? And I don't think more than a handful of teachers have ever said yes to that question. The problem is we give our students far too much feedback and don't make the students accountable for doing anything with it. So the important thing for feedback is that it should be more work for the recipient than the donor. We should give students feedback. We should make sure that they spend a lot of time making the best use of it. Activating students as learning resources for one another. A group of 15-year-olds were studying world history, and they were tested on their understanding of material delivered in lectures. So they were given the standard teacher at the front, talking at the whole class, presenting standardized material. Half of the students were trained to pose questions as they listened to the lectures, and at the end of the lectures, students were given time to review their understanding of the material. So there were effectively 4 groups. Students working individually, doing independent review, students given unstructured time as a group to discuss what they'd learned, and then 2 structured approaches. There was the structured self-questioning, so these students who had actually listened to the lecture but had been told how to, or trained how to listen attentively and to pose questions as they listened. And the 4th group was students who were discussing what they'd learned in a group after having been trained to pose questions as they listened to the lectures. So this graph on slide 22 shows what happened. The students doing independent review and doing the unstructured group discussion made a little bit of progress on their tests from the pre-test to the post-test, but almost all the gains had been lost 10 days later. What is surprising is that both the structured peer questioning and the structured self-questioning students made substantial gains at the post-test, most of which was retained 10 days later. So getting students involved in their own thinking and working in groups can be very effective in producing better long-term retention of educational material. So a couple of techniques here, one is which I call pre-flight checklist. So for example, before turning in a lab report, students need to check a number of things like proper labeling of diagrams, proper formats and protocols followed for describing experimentation. And one way of doing this is to give students a checklist of all the things that need to be in place, but then to make a buddy responsible for signing off on the checklist. So before I can turn in my assignment, I have to get my buddy to sign off that all the things that are on the checklist are properly completed. And then, if the buddy certifies that they are, it's the buddy that signs the checklist to certify that everything on the checklist is in place, and I can then turn my assignment in. If it then turns out that something on the checklist has been missed, it's my buddy who gets into trouble, not me, because he let me down. So that creates an accountability for the peer to make sure they're doing this job properly. And another technique where students can be learning resources for one another is training students to pose questions or identify group weaknesses after a piece of learning. So many teachers will finish off a piece of learning by asking groups, do you have any questions? And of course, many students don't wish to raise their hands at that point because they don't feel confident that there's a sensible question. So one way of encouraging students to ask questions is to say to groups of students, okay, in your groups, decide if you've got any questions. If a student finds that nobody in their group has an answer to the question, it can't be a dumb question. So the students will be more confident about asking the question out loud. You can anonymize this even further by issuing the students with strips of paper, and they can write their questions on the strips of paper. This then develops the literacy skills of the students, makes them better at posing the question, and allows the teacher to rapidly sort the questions into sensible themes and topics so they can actually deal with many different groups' questions at the same time. Some teachers push this even further by saying, okay, we went over some complex material here, you must have at least one question. So the teacher demands one question from each group. And there's now a strongly developing body of research that suggests that making students ask questions as part of their learning is particularly effective in improving student achievement. And finally, the fifth strategy, activating students as owners of their own learning. And this is quite an interesting study because, again, it was very well controlled. 45 teachers who were studying for a master's degree in education in Portugal were matched in terms of age, qualifications, and experience. They were also using the same curriculum scheme for the same amount of time. Half of them, or slightly less than half, just follow the regular master's program. But half of the students on this master's program followed a special program where they developed self-assessment skills with their students. So the details of the intervention were as follows. It was a 20-week intervention, and in the first 2 weeks, students were allowed to choose from a range of work provided by the teachers. These were kids as we saw in this earlier slide. Most of them were 8 or 9. Some of them were age 10 to 14 as well, largely because they'd actually been repeating a grade. So most of the students were 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. So in the first 2 weeks, they were allowed to individually choose from a range of work provided by the teacher, and then the teacher also provided students with self-assessment materials. In weeks 3 to 6, the students were encouraged to construct their own problems on new topics along the lines of those in weeks 1 and 2, and then they were allowed to select structured apparatus to help them in their solutions. So the choice was restricted, but they were nevertheless responsible for choosing. In weeks 7 to 10, the children were presented with new learning objectives, and then they were asked to make up their own problems that would help them tackle these learning objectives, and weren't given any examples to copy by the teacher. Towards the end of the project, the students' independence and autonomy was pushed even further. In weeks 11 to 14, children not only set their own problems, they actually set their own learning objectives, constructed relevant problems, and they decided themselves how to self-assess themselves. And towards the final 5 weeks of the project, the same thing happened, but with even less support from the teacher. And thus, of course, building increased freedom of choice and personal responsibility for the student. Over the 20 weeks of the study, the control group students went up by 7.8 points on this standardized test, and the experimental group went up by 15 points. This is rather extraordinary. What this means is that in this 20 weeks, the experimental group had made in 20 weeks the same amount of progress that the control group would have made in 38 or 39 weeks, effectively almost doubling the speed of student learning just by engaging the student more in their own learning. Another 2 techniques here. The first, the learning portfolio idea. The idea of the learning portfolio is that it's different from the performance portfolio that, for example, a professional artist might have. An artist will have a portfolio of their latest and best work. So if you're a visual artist, you might have something in acrylic, something in gouache, something in charcoal, something in oil, something in watercolor. And if you do something better in watercolor than was already in your portfolio, you're quite likely to take out the old piece of watercolor painting and replace it with the newest one, the best one. So in that sense, the artist portfolio is a performance portfolio because it's your latest and best. What is very valuable in education, in learning, is to keep a learning portfolio. So you don't take the older stuff out. You leave it there to show your journey. So for example, when students generate pieces of writing, they're added to the portfolio, and periodically students can go back and look at their earlier writing and compare it with their current writing to see how much progress they've made. This has two effects. First of all, it makes the students more reflective about quality writing, but more importantly, it makes every student believe that effort leads to progress. One of the most damaging beliefs that students can have about ability, as the work of Carol Dweck has shown, is many students believe that ability is fixed. There are smart kids and not so smart kids. And when you have that kind of attitude towards learning, when you're faced with a challenging task, the first thing you decide is, will I succeed? If you think you will, then you will obviously go for it in order to succeed. But if you think you might fail, and you think other people in the class will succeed, you will disengage from the learning in order to avoid being shown up. Other students see ability as incremental. They don't care whether they're going to succeed or fail on the task because they know they'll get smarter in the attempt. And what the learning portfolio does is to reinforce this idea is smart is not something you are, smart is something you get. And the second technique for this strategy, plus minus interesting, is a technique that can be used in very many different ways, but here's one example. A third grade math teacher in a school in New Jersey that I worked with, she used this technique for math homework. So she typically does reading in the first hour and then math from 10 till 11. And so during the reading hour, students have to go up and make a comment on at least one, if not all, of 3 flip charts that she's posted around the room. The plus flip chart is for writing anything they found easy. The minus flip chart is for anything they found difficult. And the interesting flip chart is obviously for anything they found interesting. And so here are some pictures of the charts. Here's the plus chart, there's the minus chart, and there's the interesting chart. And obviously, depending on which sort of screen you're seeing these on, those might be hard to read. So I've transcribed them for you here. And so here's the responses for the plus group. And many of the students are saying things like, I got the ballpark estimates. This was a subtraction activity where they had to come up with a ballpark estimate first and then check their answer was okay. I know that you have to look at it and say, okay. I quite like the one further down the page. I know how to do plus and minus because we have been doing it for a long time. If you look at the minus responses, this is really quite interesting given these students are just third graders. Obviously, students often say things like, I'm still a tiny bit confused about subtraction regrouping. I'm a little bit confused about ballpark estimates. Olivia, a girl in the class, has written, third from the bottom, I don't understand when you borrow, which column you borrow from when both are 0. And I think that's a truly remarkable insight into one's own learning. This is a third grader who has really precisely identified the things she's struggling with. I would love to be teaching a student who is that self-perceptive because I know exactly how to help. And this is what we find when students are involved in this kind of self-assessment, for example, through plus minus interesting, is they are really very focused and they help the teachers help them by being very specific about the thing they're having difficulty. And then finally, I'll just review a couple of the ones from the interesting sheet. And I think Olivia, has a really quite interesting insight here. She's fourth from the bottom on this sheet. I find it weird that you could just keep going from column to column when you need to borrow. And that is a really, I think, quite a profound and interesting comment about subtraction. So in this webinar, I've managed to, I've covered the 5 strategies of AFL. I have given you 10 techniques, 2 for each of the 5 strategies. And of course, none of these ideas are particularly new. They're all effectively things that have been around for a long, long time. The KLT pack that NWA now makes available has well over 100 of these techniques. But I think we need to understand that changing classroom practice is much more than just providing a number of tips for teachers. So much for the easy bit, as this slide says. these techniques have been around for a long time. Some teachers use them, some teachers don't. So in the final webinar, I will be talking about what kinds of support teachers need to implement these kinds of techniques in their classroom. The techniques I'm talking about entail more than just a few kind of bolt-on ideas. They entail fundamental rethinking of classroom practice, which requires teachers to go very slowly, teachers to be given choice, flexibility and support, and also to be made accountable for making changes. So in the third webinar, I'll discuss in more detail exactly what support we think teachers need to put these changes into practice. But for now, we'll just go into, I'll hand back to Kelly to see if there are any questions that anybody has asked that can be dealt with quickly in the remaining few minutes we have.
Thank you, Dylan. Well, that was really fascinating, and I actually lots of new things in there today, Dylan. Thank you for sharing that with us. A number of folks have asked questions. I'm going to summarize just a couple, Dylan. And before I do that, I'm just going to say to everyone, folks who joined a little bit after we started, everyone who has joined us today or signed up for our webinar will be receiving an email in about a week's time, which will provide a link to the live recorded webinar so you can replay it for yourself or share it with your colleagues. And you will also then have access to the actual PowerPoint. So I wanted to let you all know that indeed, yes, everyone who has registered for the webinar and attended today will be receiving that information. Because I've gotten lots of questions. I know this is a very rich, informative time with Dylan, and I know there's things that you want to reflect on or perhaps share with your colleagues. So I'm going to ask a few questions, kind of summarize a few. And Dylan, one gentleman said that you stated a good strategy is to allow students to come up with their own questions for assessment. He wanted to know how young the students were who were allowed to do this. And I know we just saw some ages, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the age readiness of kids to do this kind of practice.
Most of the studies of this, the formal psychological studies, have been done with older students, particularly college level and high school. But the teachers that we've worked with have made it work very effectively, certainly down as low as 4th and 5th grade. Other teachers say that they've got good results with this with even younger students, but we haven't seen the evidence for that yet, so I wouldn't say with any confidence that this works with the very youngest children. But I think the idea of self-evaluation can begin very early, and the preschool program really shows that even preschoolers can at least get started with the idea of self-evaluation and thinking about what kinds of questions might I pose for myself. But certainly I would say with confidence, teachers have told us that certainly 4th and 5th grade are fine with this kind of a strategy for reviewing material they've been studying.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you. Here's another really great question. Could you quickly restate the proper way to provide feedback? And I know that's really a big answer, but perhaps you could hit some of your key points, Dylan.
Obviously, this is a huge research literature.
Yeah.
If I could, and I have thought about this quite a while, if I could reduce all of the research studies down to one thing, as far as academic work is concerned, this wouldn't apply in sports necessarily, but as far as academic work is concerned, feedback should cause thinking. Feedback needs to cause a cognitive, a thinking reaction, not an emotional reaction. So if feedback allows students to compare themselves with others, then it's likely the ego involvement will be triggered and the students will compare themselves, and then you're in a fight or flight situation. So as far as possible, as long as feedback causes thinking, there's a chance it'll improve. As soon as feedback causes an emotional reaction, then the chances for learning are very slim indeed. So a couple of very obvious things. When you give students feedback, leave some work for them to do. I was talking to a 5th grader the other day, and she said, when you get a lot of feedback, it means your work wasn't very good. And I said, sorry, I don't understand. Tell me a bit more about that. And she said, well, when you do really good work, you just get A and good job. If your work isn't as good as that, you get lots of teachers' comments all over your work. So students came to believe that the more feedback you got, the worse your work was. And so one of the things we worked with teachers on is, how do you give the same amount of feedback to all students? The idea that no matter how good your piece of work is, it can always be improved. And to push that even further, whenever your books have been graded, the first 10 minutes of the next lesson will be spent with every student reacting to the feedback. So giving students less feedback, making it of higher quality, and providing classroom time during the school day for students to respond to the feedback. Those, I think, are the simplest summaries I can give of this rather complex literature.
Great, Dylan. Thank you. Well done. I know that is a big question. I'm sorry, I'm going to hit you with another big one, and then we'll wrap up here today. Several people have asked the question, how can teachers find the time to invest in effective formative assessment? Any suggestions?
Well, one of the things we're going to talk about in the next webinar, the final webinar, is the idea that you've got to stop doing something you're doing right now. You've got to take something off your plate. So I would say it's grading. Now, I'm not saying we should stop grading. I think we probably grade too much. I think our students get too much feedback, and we don't make them accountable for doing anything with it. So I think we should proceed very slowly. Maybe, for example, alternating summative and formative assessments. So in some places they found a very kind of toe in the water approach. What you do is you give students some work, they hand it in, you give them feedback on how to improve it, and then you get a grade on the second submission. So nothing that I'm saying should be taken as requiring any teacher to do any more work than they're doing right now. But what I am saying is that sometimes we can spend the time we're spending slightly differently to get a better outcome by thinking about how we can leave more of the work for the learner. So, ultimately, I think we need to grade slightly less. I think we need to give more formative feedback to students and make sure they do something with it. This is not going to be a kind of overnight fix. It's going to be very hard to do, but the schools that have done it have told us that, in fact, even on standardized tests, their test scores go up because they're making their students more thoughtful about the work.
Great, Dylan. Thank you. That's a great response to a very big question. I'm just going to summarize one final question. Dylan, you mentioned that we do have at NWA a resource with lots of strategies, hundreds of strategies actually, around formative assessment, and that is, as you see on the final screen here, if you are interested in learning more about bringing formative assessment to your school or district, we have a product called Keeping Learning on Track that actually Dylan and many bright folks at ETS helped develop over years, and it's now at NWEA. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we're happy to share that with you. It is a product with 2 years of curriculum and hundreds of techniques that support the 5 strategies. So finally, just want to remind folks, first, thank you again for joining us today. You all will receive follow-up emails in about a week with links to the recorded presentation, links to the PowerPoint that you can replay and share over time. And the next event is going to be equally informative and excellent, how to sustain the development of formative assessment using teacher learning communities, TLCs. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? Helping teachers make changes that they can maintain and continue in their classrooms to support their kids' learning. So it's a very important final webinar in our series. That's on April 3rd. You all will be receiving invitations to that as well. And Dylan, as always, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Having an hour with you is always absolutely fascinating, so thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All right, thanks everyone. See you next month.